all very welcome to St Mary's. I'd now like to introduce you to our first speaker today, Dr. Annie Gray, who is a historian specialising in food and dining from the 18th century to the mid-20th century. Annie works for a broad range of organisations as a public historian, and her various roles include lecturing, consulting, training, volunteers and heritage staff, and in a role as a costumed interpreter, as you will see through demonstration as a last presentation this afternoon. She's also a resident food historian on the BBC's Radio 4's food panel show, The Kitchen Cabinet, as well as having regular roles on James Martin's Home Comforts, The Great British Bake Off, and The One Show, among others. So welcome, Annie.
Brilliant. Well, we're starting off with World War I because let's go chronologically, we might as well. And I suspect World War I's one of those areas that you've all heard an awful lot about in the last year. Given that we are commemorating the centenary of the First World War at the moment, it will have been unavoidable. But what I want to do this afternoon is obviously to put it into its food perspective. But when you think about wartime food, if you say the words wartime food, most people will immediately think of the Second World War. If you go and you visit the Imperial War Museum or any of the other various commemorative sites, the chances are that up until last year, most of what you will have seen would be very glamorous people dressed in 1940s gear, because there's something about that era that means that as a woman, if you dress in it, you feel obliged to put red lipstick on and seamed tights. And you'll have seen that and seen people demonstrating Second World War food. And when we think about wartime food, we tend to associate anything like that with the Second World War, with rationing, with all the things that we think about, not least because it tends to be our grandparents' generation that lived through it. But the First World War, as we'll see, also had rationing, also had its own challenges, and in many ways set the agenda for what came later, as I'm sure you'll hear as we go on. The Edwardian period is one, in many ways, of extreme excess, certainly among the rich. It is a beautiful, beautiful period for dining. It is a glorious period in terms of British cuisine. It's also a period, arguably, where cuisine becomes very, very silly, very, very forced, where nature is no longer allowed upon the table unchanged. You cannot possibly, for example, put a tongue on the table. You have to take your tongue, boil your tongue, mash your tongue, put your tongue in a tongue press and sculpt it to look like a tongue, even though you could have just put the tongue on the table, which is what they would have done in previous eras. Many of you, I suspect, will have watched Downton Abbey, at least the first series, and that's Edwardian cuisine, at least when it comes to the upper classes. And traditionally, it's seen as a period of massive excess, which was brought to an end by the cataclysmic World War I. The trouble is, of course, we look back in hindsight, we know that 1914 changed everything. At the time, they didn't. So it's very easy, I think, to look at World War I's food, look at the Great War's food, and judge with hindsight. And it's something that's not necessarily terribly useful to do. I'd argue that the First World War, the Great War, did change our understanding of nutrition and did change our food policies, but it changed it as a sort of holistic whole, not just towards soldiers' nutrition, but also towards nutrition in the country as a whole. But I'd argue that it's less about nutrition and more about people understanding the moral need for food, the ethics of food, and indeed the just general morale-boosting effect of food. What we're going to do in the course of the next 40 minutes is look both at soldiers' food, so food on the front, but also food back at home, and then look a little bit at what the war necessarily changed. When you look from that to that, you realise emotionally how cataclysmic the war is going to be. But at the start, in 1914, as I'm sure you're all aware, most people thought it would all be over by Christmas. So it was never going to change anything. And I think it's important to remember that that was the general thought at the beginning of the war. That when you look at food policy and when you look at exactly what was done to feed the nation and to feed the nation's soldiers, it was done at the beginning with the assumption that nothing was going to last very long. Previous wars hadn't gone on for a very long time, or at least they hadn't affected the nation massively. Previous wars, we had a few issues, but back at home, no one had really noticed. The poor continued to starve and the rich continued to feast. So why was this war going to be any different? Edwardian eating, as I mentioned, is all about excess, at least at the rich level. But one of the huge things about the Edwardian period, and anyone who studied late Victorian or Edwardian Britain will know, is the enormous gap between rich and poor. You could easily argue that that gap is something that we're seeing increasingly in modern Britain as well. At the top end of society, you have elegant dinner parties, you have 9-course meals, you have groaning sideboards, you have an excess of meat, you have lots of vegetables as well, flowers, herbs, exotic spices. If you want to eat seasonally, well, why would you bother? We think seasonal eating is something we're just rediscovering, something people did in the past all the time, but that's simply not true. If you are rich in the Edwardian period, you force your vegetables and fruit. You have gardens full of hothouses, steam-fed greenhouses. You want a pineapple in the middle of January? You have a pineapple in the middle of January. There is no limit to what you can have if you're rich in the Edwardian period. But if you're poor, it's completely the opposite. The diet of the poor in Edwardian Britain was appalling, absolutely appalling. We talk about food boxes and food poverty now, but the biggest problem facing us at the moment is obesity, a form of malnutrition, yes, but not undernutrition in the way that the Edwardians would have viewed it, where undernutrition as opposed to simply malnutrition was the big problem. Eating experiences, of course, varied, but there are an awful lot of parallels with modern day Britain. For example, if you are poor, you are almost certainly reliant on takeaway food. In the case of Edwardian Britain, it's jacket potatoes, it's pie and mash, it's fish and chips, and it's ice cream as well, hokey pokey, usually made in the most unhygienic conditions possible in the bottom of Italian-owned flats or basements, often in urban areas. You can see there a hokey pokey stall. Many of the problems that modern Britain faces are nothing new. You also have to remember, as well as the very rich and the very poor, of course, you've got a huge middle class as well, and everything in between. Don't forget as well the domestic servant population. 12.8% of women, it's estimated, were in service in the Edwardian period. So if you are sitting in front of me at the moment, but you were back in 1912 and you're a woman, chances are you'd be factory fodder or you'd be someone's servant. If you're a man, even more so. The proportion of you in front of me who'd be rich enough to eat well, I'm probably looking at 1 or 2 people. So in terms of the problems that we face today, they are not necessarily dissimilar. They are dissimilar in some ways, obviously, but in terms of the statistics and in terms of the problems facing society, they are very, very similar indeed. The menus that you would expect to see in pre-war Britain, well, as varied as the people are. This one is the Queen's menu, the household dinner in 1899, so just at the end of the Victorian period. And you can see she presents all of her guests with a choice of 2 soups, one light and one dark, etiquette dictating that if you're a man, you choose the dark soup to show your masculine side, whereas if you're a woman, you choose the light soup to show that you are, above all else, genteel, delicate and lovely, as all women should be, obviously. You're then going to have a choice of fish. You're going to have a choice of entrees, fancy dishes, normally made by a French chef at that level of society. You're going to go on to a remove course, a roast, entremet, another set of remove courses, this time at the end involving sweet dishes. This is an enormous amount of food. The pattern of eating: soup, fish, fancy dishes, roast meats, boiled meats, fancy sweet dishes, and then at the end of all of that, dessert, which is usually fruit and nuts. As I mentioned, the fruit would usually be hothoused. The leftovers from a table like this would filter down the household afterwards, so that your servants would have first dibs on what's on the table, then after them the lower servants, and what was left after all of that would go into buckets and be taken out to the poor at the gate, so that if you were the poor of the Queen's parish at Osborne or Buckingham Palace or anywhere else like that, or indeed the poor of any other big house's parish, even Strawberry Hill here, if you're poor here, most of what you're eating is going to be fed to you in a bucket at the gate. So, not the greatest thing in the world. If you're middle class, well, obviously you're not going to have that much food, but you're still going to present a fair bit at dinner. Your breakfast may well be the English classic breakfast dishes: kedgeree, devilled kidneys, bacon and eggs, porridge, or just toast and butter. Your lunch, more of the same, breads and cheeses. And your dinner, this one is a dinner of invitation, so the kind of thing you invite your friends over to. You can still see you've got soup, you've got fish, you've got roast meat, mutton cutlets, sweetbreads, roast pheasant, dressed spinach, apple charlotte. That one is for about 8 people. So you get quite a lot of choice and quite a lot of food. But as you drift further down the social classes, and of course there are more people, significantly more people in the poorer sorts than there are in the upper sorts, you start to get more scenarios like this. A lorry driver earning 20 shillings a week with 2 children. He's doing quite well because he doesn't have a very, very large family, but he still subsists on an average diet of bread, bacon and coffee, pork, onions, potatoes and Yorkshire pudding, bread, butter and tea, bread and meat. He's lucky, he's having meat. You find in families like this, and anyone who is interested in studying the poor in late Victorian England can do no better than look at the Rowntree report and the other reports that come out at the end of the 19th century looking specifically at the state of the poor, that if you are at the bottom of society, you are basically living on a diet of bread, tea, often heavily adulterated tea at that, and bacon at the weekends. If you're a woman, you're going to be worse off than the husband you are married to, because as a woman you are going to privilege your husband and your children over yourself. There are shocking statistics from Edwardian England. Women entering Pentonville prison are put on a subsistence diet which the government deems the very least necessary to sustain human flesh. The women go in and they have their heights and weights measured so we can tell their BMIs. The women go in and they put on weight in a subsistence diet. They come out healthier than they went in. This tells you exactly what Edwardian England is like. And I paint this picture because although an awful lot is said about the Great War food, especially for people at the front, I'm showing you how bad it was at home before the war so that you can appreciate that during the war, no matter how bad the food is, if you've got some, you're doing better than you did before the war. Don't forget as well that food adulteration is rife in Edwardian England. The government has started finally to legislate on it after years of voluntary agreements, and we all know how well they work. Finally, for example, alum, an astringent, is coming out of bread. Finally, tea is being sold in branded packets. If you've ever wondered why we are so attached to our brands, it's at least partly because when they first came in, they were a guarantee of quality, of purity, and an awful lot of foodstuffs were marketed in the late Victorian period on purity. So Rowntree's Elect Cocoa, the purest you can buy. Why? Because if you're buying impure cocoa, you're not just buying something that might taste a bit funny, you're buying something that might kill you. So when we think about food adulterants today, they tend not to kill us. In that period, they often would. And if it didn't kill you, well, if you're at the bottom of society and you're eating heavily adulterated bread with pea meal and bone meal and cornmeal in instead of wheat, the chances are that that is replacing another nutrient in your diet. So you might not immediately cark it, but you are eating something that you're taking in instead of something better. That's one of the problems, for example, with milk being watered down, which was extremely common at the point, and beer being watered down as well. Milk was usually watered down and then had sheep's brains added to it to add a sort of creamy texture so that you didn't notice it had been watered down. So if you do want to sample the delights of Edwardian England, you can do no better than buy a pint of skimmed milk and add in some sheep's brains. Job done. It's probably more nutritious than without the brains, though, let's face it. Margarine is also very popular, but as we'll see, that's one of the big growth areas during the First World War. Whoops. The science of food is, as you probably are aware, relatively limited. People are aware that there are these things called vitamins. They have been discovered, and there is a lot of work going on, especially in Germany and in Britain, to look at what these nutrients are. Now this page, you probably can't read it, but he talks about the fact that we know there is something in lemon juice and fruit and fresh vegetables that cures scurvy. We don't know what it is yet. We simply haven't discovered vitamin C. Now, arguably, the fact that nutrients have not yet been singled out and made into pill form is actually a good thing. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's a lot of debate over whether it's a really good idea to talk about nutrients or whether it's a better idea to just talk about food. I always think if you get too hung up on vitamins and the things that are in food, you end up with Soylent, which those of you who have heard of it is a brilliant invention by a computer geek in Silicon Valley who has invented a new liquid food that he can take so he doesn't have to spend half an hour cooking each day. He claims to have lived on it for a year and says it's absolutely brilliant, except he won't admit exactly what's happened to the bacteria in his gut, and apparently it tastes like grit mixed with mud. Great! Nice. However, at this point, what you have got is an understanding of the fact that some foods are better than others, and a sort of experimental vein, usually on people in workhouses and prisons, to work out which bits are better than other bits. The focus on the time is on proteins, on carbohydrates and on fats, especially on proteins. And when people are working out diets for special groups, be it prisoners or workhouse inmates, they tend to judge it by the amount of protein. But it is becoming increasingly aware, based on the health of those in prisons and workhouses, that protein alone is not the greatest measure of what's in food. People fed on bread protein and people fed on meat protein seem to suffer from different diseases, their guts react in different ways. All of this, however, is rather in its infancy when the Great War breaks out. The other thing that has been around since the mid-19th century, but is only really just beginning to come into its own, is the calorie as a unit of measurement in terms of the energy in food. Again, people concentrate on grams of protein, grams of carbohydrate, grams of fat. They're not really into the calorie yet. That will change as war grows ever nearer. The government has intervened in some cases. At the time of the Great War, we have a very non-interventionist government, a government that believes that if you intervene in food policy in particular, then you are going to be rather socialist. A government that is so scared of socialist threats that it will not legislate if it thinks it will affect the people. A government that really does adhere to the old 18th century idea that a government's only role is to guarantee life, liberty and property, and not to interfere in any other way. It has been forced to intervene, however, especially in the cases of food adulteration, as I mentioned earlier. And what really does knock the government for six is when there start to be returns come back from recruitment for the Boer War at the end of the 19th century. The returns are shocking. This is based on volunteers rather than conscripts. But when young men are interviewed and assessed to join the army, to go out and fight for the motherland, it's found that about 40% of the volunteers have to be rejected. And that is even after the height restriction on allowing young men into the forces is reduced to 5 foot. 40% of young men are deemed to be unfit to fight. And that's when you don't mind. They're going to go out and die. Who really cares? But you're bringing in people and you simply cannot have them, whether because they're suffering from undernutrition, whether it's because they have diet-related diseases, rickets, scurvy, dental cavities, all the things we would expect to see as a result of poor nutrition. These are all the symptoms these young men exhibit. Only about half of the remaining 60% are actually deemed good as soldiers. There's another sort of grey area where people get through, but it's fairly likely that they will succumb to disease at the first opportunity. The government commissions a report into physical deterioration, and it finds that, depending on the area, infant mortality is still at about 25% in some areas, that 33% of all children in Britain are technically undernourished. They simply don't have enough to eat, never mind the right foods. The height difference between rich and poor children in some areas is as much as 5 inches in 12-year-old boys, a clear indication that the right foods promote good growth. And deficiency diseases are rife. The government finally acts. It brings in old age pensions. It brings in national insurance so that if you are unemployed, you will at least have some means of help. It brings in school meals. It brings in mother and baby schemes. And it prioritises cookery lessons in schools. Gosh, where have we heard all of those policies before? Could it be that we're just bringing them back again to tackle the current problems? I wonder. However, these changes don't really have time to take effect when the Great War breaks out and basically all hell breaks loose. War, 1914 to 1918. At the beginning, it was all about volunteers. In 1916, conscription comes in. Single men between 18 to 40 had to go and fight. Very quickly, it became married men as well. Also, the age limit went up, 51 at the end of the war. You could be exempted for work of national importance, or if you were a cleric. There were also conscientious objectors, usually religious, increasingly associated with vegetarianism, which meant if you were vegetarian in the ranks, you were seen as scum. Conscription lasted, by the way, until mid-1919, so it didn't end at the end of the war. Women were not conscripted in the Great War, but they were urged to join in or join up. And unemployment vanishes as a result of conscription pretty much overnight. So there are good and there are bad aspects to the Great War. We lose millions of men and women killed fighting. But with unemployment completely gone, with women working properly for the first time, for the very first time pretty much in history. Pretty much everyone in the country has enough to eat. And that is a huge, huge thing to say. Initially, the government has no concerns over food supply and just assumes it will all be all right, which is quite silly given that we are completely reliant on imports. We haven't been self-sufficient as a country since some point in the Middle Ages. At that point, in 1914, about 2/3 of our sugar comes from Austria-Hungary, 4/5 of our wheat is from the US, 3/4 of our cheese comes from outside the country, 2/3 of our ham and bacon, 3/5 of our butter, and of course all of our exotic goods. This is a nation that runs on tea and sugar. Where are they from? Well, not Britain, put it that way. Obviously, anything that's citrus fruit, oranges, pineapples, all the fine things in life, also from abroad. But at this point, no one could predict the length of the war. No one realised how all-consuming it would be. So you can see why, from a governmental point of view, there was no need to regulate. They concentrated at first, of course, on feeding the army. Those people at the front needed to be fed or they simply wouldn't be able to fight. And you've got the army, the navy, the nascent air force, and there's many, many fronts. We tend to concentrate on the western front, on the trenches, but there's also Mesopotamia, Africa and Greece. And you've got a lot of forces fighting, not just Britain, which is where I'm concentrating, but our allies and the dominions as well. Pretty much nothing in terms of feeding the soldiers has moved on since the Crimean War in the 1840s. If you want to study a really impactful war in terms of the impact that war has on food, the Crimea is the one to pick. We go into the Crimean War and it's appalling. We come out and it's slightly less than appalling. But even at the start of the Great War, there's no designated cooks or catering corps, there's just the Army Service Corps. Cooks are drawn from the ranks, they have very little training, a bit of basic training at Aldershot and that's about it. There's a reliance on the men being able to cook themselves, something that most men can't do in 1914. On the front line, it's very much about billy cans and fires. Off the front line, as you'll see, slightly better cookhouses. Regulation of the food tends to concentrate on hygiene. One of the big lessons from the Crimean War was that if you don't have good hygiene, you will lose an awful lot of people. One of the things that happened during the Crimean War, I'm sure you've all heard of Florence Nightingale wandering around with her lamp. She was largely pointless compared to a man called Alexis Soyer, who went out and pointed out that the open sewer running past the kitchen might be more of a problem when it came to deaths than light, for example. Also, he did suggest that if you were boiling the cloths that people had died in the same vats you then used to make soup, that again, this might cause a little bit of a problem later on in life. He was, of course, right. Once those two reforms went through, the death rate halved. More people died of disease in most wars leading up to the Great War than died of anything in terms of enemy action. By the end of 1918, there were 5.5 million troops on rations, plus about 1 million animals. You shouldn't forget about horses upon which the war was run. And you find that ammunition and animal fodder takes up most of the shipping space that goes across to the various fronts. People have said that's because the horses were better fed than the men. It's not true. Animal food just takes up a lot more room and is a lot more weighty than food for men. The military rations were pretty good if you got them. Looking at that, you can see that a pound of bread a day and a pound of meat a day, thinking back to our working class heroes back in the Edwardian period, that's more than you would normally get in a month if you'd been a working class man in Edwardian England. You get bacon, cheese, the all-important tea and sugar, absolutely vital. Fresh or dried vegetables, admittedly, jam. This is a real improvement in the diet for most of the troops fighting on the front. We may look at it now and think, I'm not quite so certain about the old fresh versus dried vegetables, but do not forget that this was also supplemented by what could be found locally and also by foraging. The various guidebooks to cuisine, they don't talk about foraging obviously because that's a modern, slightly pretentious invention. They just talk about finding what you can in nature, which is what people called it before they started calling it foraging and made it fashionable. There was provision as well for people on special diets. The Indian troops, for example, who also had a ration of spices, including turmeric, ginger, chilies and garlic. Vegetarians, in theory, got extra sugar, and they also got condensed milk instead of the meat. And there were variations for the Chinese Labour Corps, the Egyptian Labour Corps, the Fijian labourers, POWs and invalids. But That's sort of on paper. There were extra rations, and this was an ideal, and it didn't always work quite as well in reality. The daily cash, by the way, was absolutely vital, as we'll see, because what you had in your ration didn't always make it to you, and also boredom was a really big problem. It's quite eager, this thing. Your supply lines took the form of a sort of three-staged process, really. First of all, there was a lot of big bulk cooking. So things like these two bakehouses. This one is over in Egypt, and that one's in Dieppe. People making huge amounts of bread, which is then shipped off to the front in sacks. The bread had the reputation of being so hard you couldn't eat it unless you dunked it in your stew. Many people preferred biscuits because they softened when they were cooked. The biscuits were usually made back in the UK, often by Peak Freen or Huntley and Palmer, who were the big biscuit companies at the time, and were turned over during the war to making ration biscuits. When these were shipped off to the front, and when you got to the sort of area around the various fronts, you then had the traditional machinery of wartime cooking. So, for example, the Aldershot oven, you can see them here dug in. They're basically a beehive oven. This is the same technology as you would get in a medieval house, or even, in fact, a Roman house. You've got these enormous military ovens on wheels as well. What you can see immediately from looking at that is that you've got baked goods and you've got boiled goods. That's it in terms of your methods of cooking, and most of them really are boiled and boiled and boiled. You are going to boil a lot of things until all of the nutrients have completely disappeared. You also have this, the Soyer stove. Remember I mentioned the man who went out and shut down the open sewer at the kitchen at Scutari? Well, he also invented this, and this was in use by the British Army until the 1970s. So you're looking at a piece of kit that was invented in about 1843 and went on until about 1973. Here is Alexis Soyer himself standing by it. You stick a fire in the bottom and you boil everything that's going in the top. You can see one in use over here during the Second World War. They're brilliant because they don't create an awful lot of smoke, which means that if you are right on the front line, then the enemy is not going to see what's going on. They're not so great in terms of actually turning out anything you might want to eat, but nevertheless, they were in use, they were successful, and a lot of people responded to them with a great deal of nostalgia when interviewed about them later on. A typical week, you don't just get your ration given to you and then get told to deal with it. A typical week would involve all of those rations being made into meals by a cookhouse, either those further back off the lines or those quite on the lines, or if you're a man actually in the trenches or on the very front line himself, then you do have an emergency ration you're cooking yourself. And you can see that the meals are not bad. I mean, they might not be to our taste today, but quite frankly, if I was eating this lot, I'd be fairly happy. Your breakfast, tea, coffee or cocoa and butter, maybe some haddock, maybe some sausages, something that you can go out and die with in your stomach. Your dinner, always had it around midday at this point, that's a class-based thing. Roast meat, pea soup, meat pies, cabbages, that kind of thing. Horse and pea soup became apparently very, well, not popular, but certainly ubiquitous if the rations didn't get to the front. So it does give you an idea of the kind of meals that are being prepared. And then your tea, so tea and marmalade, tea and butter. You will see the prevalence of tea as something upon which the army marched. It was good because it helped morale to be boosted. If you only had a cold meal, if you were suffering from trench foot, something hot in your hand always helped. But more than that, it made sure that the men were boiling the water. And given that the water probably had rats dying in it, that's usually a good thing as well. So tea fulfills a lot of functions when it comes to feeding the troops. If you're actually on the front itself, you're probably cooking in something like this, a mess tin, a brazier, stacked over a fire, or indeed just lighting something underneath, and you can see it in action over here with men eating down there. The mess tin is the basic implement, the basic thing that all troops have. You can boil, you can cook, you can do whatever you want to, you can make bread as well in the bottom half, and the top half doubles as some form of vessel. And people have what they're called racing spoons, which are kept down the top of their puttees, because there is notorious competition for food, and if you can't race your spoon in and out of everybody else's quicker than they can, you may well starve. There's a lot of scavenging as well. People do start up quasi-allotments anywhere they can do just to supplement the ration. Because there are inevitably issues. What happens on paper has a tendency to stay on paper. The supply was impossible to maintain, especially in the early days due to enemy action, problems with supply chains, getting things in, vermin as well, a massive problem. There was bad planning from above. At one point it was suggested that all of the troops should be issued with a daily orange to combat scurvy. It's a nice idea, but the toilet facilities out on the front were pretty limited, and most troops had what they called their poo hand and their clean hand. eating an orange takes 2 hands, so you don't really want to be using the one of them. People got very, very bored. You find a lot of unopened tins still littering any First World War site because people simply got so bored they didn't want to eat the food. Eventually, the people at the front line got extra tea and extra sugar in recognition that morale was a bit of an issue. There was a huge uncertainty as to what people needed, again because of the low levels of nutritional knowledge at the beginning of the war. But eventually in 1916 a full-scale report was commissioned, and it suggested men at the front needed around 4,500 calories a day in order to be able to do their jobs. Those at home needed about 3,500, significantly more than the so-called government guidelines now for us, but then we tend to sit on our bottoms in front of our computers all day rather than going out and killing Germans, etc. There was a huge confusion as well over exactly what was doing what. Scurvy continued to be an issue, and by this point the British troops were all issued with limes in order to combat scurvy. The problem is that lime juice doesn't contain nearly the same amount of vitamin C as lemon juice, so lime juice didn't actually do an awful lot. Eventually, lemon juice was replaced instead, along with the daily rum ration. When sieges were involved, it could get really bad. At the Siege of Kut in 1916, those that were white troops all got beriberi due to the fact they were eating white bread and had very low levels of vitamin B. They got fairly low levels of vitamin B. The Indian troops got scurvy because they weren't eating meat, which protected them to some extent against the beriberi, but they did eat whole barley. You tend to find that nutritional diseases influence different groups of people depending on the diets they're prepared to go through. Those eating meat, those not eating meat. Vegetarians, non-vegetarians. It can get absolutely awful. The Siege of Kut is particularly renowned because of the levels of both beriberi and scurvy, and it's really after that that the government decides that lemons are going to be better than limes. People did supplement the ration. They got chocolate sent from home. There were field kitchens. Here you've got a YMCA kitchen set up. They could also buy and barter with the local population. This one is a chocolate bar that was sent out in the first year of the war to all the troops that hailed from Yorkshire, sent out by the mayors of York, the chocolate city. Every single soldier, including those in POW camps, got an engraved box with a chocolate bar inside. That one survives because the man who got it sent it back to his family rather than eat it as a memento of war. You also have estaminets, which are French cafes, usually set up often in bombed out buildings, and you get a real obsession after the war for a brief period with œufs frites. You can't really have chicken and chips or steak and chips because of the lack of meat, even in France, therefore you get egg and chips. And it becomes this ubiquitous food of war, egg and chips, served French style. You also get a lot of white wine, watered down white wine being drunk, and it's from this period that we get the word plonk to mean cheap white wine, because it's an abbreviation of vin blanc, plonk. You do find generally that the troops fare fairly well in the Great War. If you actually look and analyse, and there's not a great deal of analysis being done, and it's very difficult to tell what people would have died of if they hadn't been blown up first, you tend to find that far fewer people die of disease, at least curable nutritional related diseases, than would have died of them in any other war before. Most troops die from enemy action. Quite a few die from alcoholism, it must be said, with the daily rum ration, but I think they probably would have died of alcoholism anyway. Presumably they were already alcoholics when they got there. Back in Blighty, the civilians didn't necessarily fare quite as well, or at least not at first. Huge queues. The army was privileged. The government didn't see the need to regulate food provision back at home. It thought that fair trade, free trade, would really encourage people to just feed the nation of their own accord. Obviously, that didn't happen. There was widespread food hoarding. There wasn't that much of a black market because the government did step in before it became too bad. But you did get an awful lot of food queues and the start of civil unrest. The first couple of years weren't too bad. 1914 to 16, most people managed to get through. But by 1916, there were reports of civil unrest being led predominantly by women, because they're all that's left, especially in the industrial towns of the north. And that report that I mentioned earlier, the one that comes back with the minimum calorific requirement for the troops, also comes back with a minimum calorific requirement for civilians. And it suggests that most people are still, in theory, able to access 3,500 calories a day. But again, that's in theory. The rich tend to be able to access more calories than the There are voluntary restrictions to start off with. We see it now, don't we? Trans fats, all the various other things the government is trying to legislate against and refusing because it's all right. All these companies will sign up to voluntary restrictions and it'll all be fine. It won't, actually. And that's exactly what happened in the First World War. So first of all, the king put out a message to his people, asking them to eat less food, especially less bread, because we're so reliant on wheat imports, and wheat imports tend to come from America, and America are starting increasingly to supply us with ammunition and various goods that we need for the war effort. But the idea is if you eat less bread, you're eating less wheat, we import less wheat, we can import more guns. It's a simple equation. You can imagine, if you're not eating that much anyway and you're quite wedded to your bread, that you're not actually going to eat that much less bread. If you've not got a great choice in your diet, you're going to continue what you do. There is eventually a recognition this isn't really working. The appointment of what will become the Ministry of Food in 1916 under Lord Devonport. He is then succeeded by a man called Lord Ronda, who is somewhat more decisive, and he takes over in 1917. It is recognised increasingly that voluntary restrictions are not going to work. People are not eating less bread. DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, is starting to be cited by 1917 as something which perhaps we can start to use. DORA is the act that enables the government to bring in censorship, to requisition buildings, to suspend trial by jury, that kind of thing. It also bans kite flying, so it's quite wide-ranging. There are exhortations. If you are a housewife in Great War Britain, you will not be able to avoid posters like this. Emotional bribery. What's wrong with a bit of emotional bribery? I risked my life to bring you food. Seeing that poster, who wouldn't eat 2 less slices of bread a day? I mean, I ask you. The kitchen is the key to victory, and yes, if you eat less bread, we can win the war. It's not subtle, I would say, but no, it doesn't really work either. Bread is therefore changed. It starts to be a national loaf, which is introduced in 1916 and has an extraction rate of 76%. That goes up to 81%, which has an obligatory 5% non-wheat flour added to it, and when it peaks in April 1918, it's up at 92%. It's basically wholemeal bread by that point, and has soya flour and potato flour added to it as well. So what starts off as a nice white loaf that's not particularly brilliant for you, but it's probably better than the white slice that we get today, ends up being actually quite a lot better for you, but nobody wants to eat it because we've spent 500 years hankering after white bread as the food of the rich. So going back to wholemeal bread, that is completely unthinkable. The scheme is not loved, predominantly because the rich keep getting round it, as this Punch cartoon is a fairly graphic demonstration. Eating out booms because you can eat out with no restriction, and if you're rich you can afford to eat out. So why worry about your bread consumption if you can toddle down to the Savoy and have a 3-course meal instead? You're allowed 3 courses because meals are increasingly restricted as well, eating out. 2 courses in 1916 at lunchtime, 3 courses in the evening, but there's not much restriction on what you can eat. So again, you might decide that actually when you go out and dine on this rather lovely 3-course meal, it does rather beat the whole idea of voluntary restriction. There's also small-scale sort of fiddling around the corners is what I would say. So for example, you're restricted on how much cake you can serve in cafes. There's a ban on crumpets, and you're not allowed to serve meat in cafes before 10:30. These really are sort of tinkering. They're not going to solve the problem. Eventually, at the end of 1917, it is decided upon that rationing needs to come in. It is anathema to the British government, but there is no other way. Ration cards are therefore prepared. There's quite a lot of confusion. People get forms to fill in where they are told that rationing will be by household, and then they change their mind and it becomes per person, so they have to fill in 2 forms. It doesn't look like a scheme that anyone's going to have a lot of faith in, but when it comes in January 1918, it does prove to be successful. And the key to its success is that it's completely equitable. Rich and poor are allowed the same amounts. And it's quite difficult by this stage to get round that, as food shortages are increasingly biting. Production is also ramped up. You can see the Boy Scouts there in their stripy hats digging allotments. And allotments go in outside things like Kensington Palace, as you can see on the picture there. The Women's Land Army is widely recruited from women of Britain. And land girls, which I'm sure you're all familiar with from World War II, are also a part of the Great War. About 113,000 women end up working on the land by the end of the war, plus the POWs that come over here tend to be used for the land. It's particularly a problem because in spring 1917 the government is told quite shortly that it has just over a month's worth of supplies of food stockpiled in Britain, and that if the U-boat campaign continues, we will, quite frankly, starve within a month. So production's ramped up, and that's really the springboard for rationing starting as well. There are many problems. You can't get hold of fertilisers because most of the ingredients are the same ones that are being used to make gunpowder. And the light is a problem. British summertime is brought in, therefore, in 1916 that plagues us still every time the clocks go back and forward. But the point is to increase the amount of daylight that you get to cultivate your vegetables. When rationing does come in, well, as I said, it works. Bring your sugar cards to Selfridges, of course. You'll get the same amount of sugar, though, as if you took it down to your local co-op, and that's really the point. Sugar was rationed, and that was the first thing to go on, 8 ounces a week. Then you get meat, which is rationed by value. Some of it is off the ration, things like offal, horse meat, all not rationed. And by the summer, you tend to get most staples being restricted. Butter and margarine, you can have 5 ounces combined. Jam, 4 ounces. Tea, 2 ounces. Bacon, 8 ounces, which goes up to 16 ounces later on once American stocks of bacon start coming in. Any of you that have eaten American bacon today will know it's vile. It was just as vile then, so people tended to ignore the extra ration. And the idea was to push people to fill up on cheap, starchy foods. Potatoes, national bread, things to be made with flour if you can get it. Potatoes were really big. At the same time as trying to get you to eat less bread, you were being encouraged to eat more potatoes. There was also an educational campaign, of course. Win the War cookery book. Every page tells you to eat less bread, I should point out. This kitchen up here, this is a potato cookery lesson going on. So the idea is that if you are a woman and you're struggling, you are going to be given the wherewithal to cook the stuff. You're not just going to be told that you can't have any food and left to get on with it. There are also schemes to feed the masses. One of them, the national kitchens, tends to fail because it tends to be seen as being in competition with existing restaurants which are struggling. But the idea behind the national kitchens, these national feeding centres, is that you can go along and you can get a cheap meal. A couple of pence will buy you meat and 3 veg and maybe some rice pudding with corn flour. But people still associate these, the idea of mass feeding, with soup kitchens and charity. So this is one initiative that really doesn't work. One that is more popular is factory canteens. They are obligatory for munitions factories because that way you can make sure that the people who are working at them don't drink. And you really don't want to be drunk when you're filling bombs. So alcohol licensing restriction comes in at the same time. These canteens are quite strictly regulated and they are very, very popular. It's estimated that there are about 1,000 canteens by 1918, supplying 1 million meals a day, so a fair amount. Put simply, no one's starving in Britain anymore. And the meals, as you can see, I'd say they're better than the ones at the front. And again, I would say these are all things that you can kind of find something to eat for everyone. If you don't like tripe and onions, you probably like boiled beef and carrots, or stewed fruit, or lentil soup. They are all British classics in some ways. There's not a lot there for the vegetarians among you, I will say that, but then there aren't a lot of vegetarians at the time anyway, so it's not seen as a major problem. You can see quite graphically the effects of rationing in terms of consumption. What you've got up here is you've got potatoes taking over from flour on this blue line at the top there, and the large brown one there is margarine taking over from butter and lard, a nice processed unhealthy fat which at the time doesn't have any vitamins added to it at all, taking over from good old animal fat and milk-based fats. I wouldn't say it's necessarily great in terms of the health of the nation, and it's from this point that the obsession with using margarine in cooking really dates. It gets given another boost during the Second World War. In the aftermath of the war, some of those trends stay. Potatoes settle back down again, but margarine still continues to be eaten a lot. People have got the taste for it. And there are some quite fun effects in some ways. Benedictine up here. The Burnley Miners Club, Burnley Working Men's Club, is the single biggest consumer of Benedictine outside France. Why? Because the troops that came from Burnley were waiting in 1918 in Fécamp, near the Benedictine factory, and they were ill. Obviously, they were jaded, they were suffering. It was post-war, they may not have had broken arms and broken legs, but many of them were suffering from shell shock, and they're all billeted on this small town near a distillery that produces a liqueur which is sold as being a health liqueur. So of course, they drink it. And they drink quite a lot of it. And they bring the taste back from Normandy to Burnley in Lancashire. And still today, if you go to a football match in Burnley, you will stand on the terraces drinking Benedictine and hot water rather than drinking beer. And that comes straight from the First World War. A curious effect. More obviously, you get an aftermath where people come back and the government resolves to do something about the poverty problem. It's going to build homes for heroes. It's going to allow everyone to be everywhere. It's going to give the nation back its health. It fails miserably. Vagrancy goes up and the government seems to forget all of its promises. Unfortunately, we largely go back to a pre-war state of affairs. Yes, school meals and some of the various initiatives tried before the war are continued, but by and large, we fail as a nation to provide, to really learn the lessons of the war. They will, as you'll see, be brought back to the fore during the Second World War, but otherwise they don't tend to be. Where we do see a change is generally in the food culture of the country. You tend to see, quite obviously, that menus get smaller, that we tend to simplify our cuisine. By the 1920s, there's a vogue among women for dieting, for counting calories. That would have been unthinkable before the Great War, because who knew what a calorie was, quite frankly, apart from the scientists? You see a great boost given to science, and the science of nutrition in particular, because all of those lessons that were learned about why people were dying of scurvy and beriberi, the lesson learned was we don't know why they're dying. Therefore, we need to study it. So you do get a great growth in terms of nutritional science between the wars, given a boost by the number of people who had preventable illnesses during it. But you can see here in the wedding breakfast for Buckingham Palace in 1923 that it is shorter and plainer than that royal menu that we saw before. And that this, your sort of average middle-class meal, seems to be a little bit shorter, a little bit plainer. It's the era of the grapefruit. You think it's the 70s? It's not. So there is a change after the Great War, but it's not as great as it could have been. It's a period where, for the first time in history, people have enough to eat, where there's almost full-time employment, because the men are employed dying and the women are employed making guns to go and kill other people. It's a great period for death in some ways, but it's also a great period for being one where people do actually become healthy for 4 years, and then we lose it all again. How depressing. I've put up a brief reading list if anybody does want to note those down. I wouldn't recommend Wikipedia as a source, obviously, but there are some various things around. And likewise, if you're looking at late 19th century nutrition, the Rowntree report, which I mentioned, is your go-to source. In terms of the development of various aspects of the war, these ones I would say are a pretty good start. And if you're not drawn towards books, the Imperial War Museum has a brilliant website and is well worth a visit. Visit it in the next year or so while all of the World War I Great War commemorative stuff is still on, is all I would say. Thank you.
Just wondering, you mentioned about adulteration of food and how that was quite common, and really I suppose that's something that, you know, would kind of make us gasp now to think that that actually happened. So, you know, how long did that go on for, and how did the government, you know, intervene to stop that?
It starts to be a real problem at the end of the 18th century. Up to that point, we haven't had enough population pressure to really mean that merchants have to adulterate, or at least that's their claim, that they're not going to make enough money so they have to. And it peaks in the Victorian period, partly because of the industrialisation of food processes, partly because small-scale businesses are being forced out of business, so they feel the need to adulterate food to make more profit, and partly because they can get away with it. There's a chap called Arthur Hassel who writes a whole series of articles in The Lancet, and he really exposes the scandal and forces the government to change it. But I suppose the peak is really, as you'd expect from in terms of industrial development, it's around 1830 to 1880, and it's very widespread. There's various analyses done in the Lancet of foodstuffs, and there isn't a single loaf of bread that doesn't have alumine. All milk that's sampled has been watered down. I mean, it's universal. Tea is habitually adulterated with other people's used tea leaves and brick dust and sort of smearings from the street. So who knows what you're eating in there, quite frankly. And it is a huge, huge problem. It's very difficult to, you can identify certain deaths from it. There's a case where a confectioner in Manchester is looking to put plaster of Paris in his sweets to sort of bulk them out a bit, and he accidentally uses arsenic instead. Oops. So that causes a fair amount of deaths, as you'd imagine. But most of it's more insidious. Most of it is simply that you're eating something that's replacing a much better foodstuff for you. So plaster of Paris obviously isn't going to do you any good, but it won't kill you. But on the other hand, even sugar is probably better than plaster of Paris. So it's a huge issue. It's becoming better by the Edwardian period, partly because manufacturers themselves realise that they can use it as a marketing tool. So with my cynical hat on, I would say, Cross and Blackwell don't take the copper out of their pickles because of the health of the nation. Cross and Blackwell take the copper out of their pickles because they know they can sell more pickles if they say they've taken the copper out of their pickles and market it on purity. Up to that point, by the way, if you bought pickles, they'd all be bright green, because if you pickle vegetables in copper, apart from giving you massive copper poisoning, which will eventually kill you, it makes them go green. So they look really pleasing to the eye, but they'll kill you.
I also thought it was interesting when you spoke about bread and raising the extraction rate of flour. And now today, obviously, we know we're still really lovers of this, white bread, and presumably that is in part due to, is that fair to say, due to people disliking this wartime bread? That when that, the extraction rate was lowered again, that people, could get their hands on white bread again. Do you think
it's more about a sort of historical desire to eat white bread? So if you look back at the medieval period, if you have 6 different grades of flour, first, second, third, sick things is the last one, and the rich eat the finest flour. It's normally been bolted, so sieved through a silk cloth. So the white flour that you get is very white, very pure, very lovely. And malt loaf, which is what the rich are eating, is what the poor aspire to eat. So if you're at the bottom end of the social scale, you're not even eating sick things, you're probably eating acorn bread or barley bread or something that's pretty hideous. And as you get further up, you eat better and better bread. So there is an aspiration to eat white bread that you see very clearly throughout history. Servants that go into households demand white bread, and if you want to show your servants they are servants, you deliberately feed them not so white bread. So it's very much about class warfare. You then get roller milling of flour coming in the mid-19th century, which takes out the wheat germ, so that if you have white bread it's completely unhealthy, and people don't care. People don't know, but they certainly don't care. They just want white bread. So the desire for white bread is linked to the desire to have something on your table which just shows that you have gentility and loveliness, that you are one of the rich. And of course the sort of swing today is that if you are a sort of foodie and an aficionado, you seek out interesting grains and you have your own home grain mill, and you'd never dream of eating white sliced because you want to eat an artisan sourdough that's been made at midnight with the milk of several asses or something. So it's sort of we've swung round. If it becomes cheap and available, then the rich won't eat it anymore.
Okay, thank you, Annie.